And then crucially, what I found, as I said, was how tools were being, like Linktree, were being used to monetize these fake cures. And I think part of the problem is that it's just so accessible and so easy to monetize content. There's so little regulation. And I see this as a real issue. And I only focused on TikTok. I mean, I haven't studied the same example on YouTube Shorts or Instagram Reels. But what was alarming for me was it was just at a scale that I've never seen on any other platform. And I think so much of that is because of the centrality of the algorithm to the user experience on TikTok, and the way in which as soon as you open the app, your For You page is just feeding you this endless scroll of videos. And if you're looking for health content, often what's really engaging are these sensational videos, which are all about promising miracle cures and hooking people because it offers something that they're alleging mainstream medical practitioners aren't providing people for whatever reason.
Can't offer. So these were the top 50 recommended videos that you were looking at. Excited to have you because I'm getting into the online space, and as a nurse, you get taught to do no harm. That's kind of the mantra. It's not the best mantra, but we get taught to do no harm, right? And as someone who's getting into this space, I really don't want to go down the direction of doing harm and not realizing I'm doing harm and all of these things. So let's start a little bit about, let's go into your background a little bit. You started looking into how influencers establish trust, authority, intimacy, not even necessarily in the internet space. It was more so just the wellness space, right? That's where it started, right?
Yeah. So I can really date this quite clearly because prior to 2015, it had been a very interesting space online where we had seen the role of digital technologies be used in a variety of ways for collective social movements, some of which were really beneficial, but these novel ways that people were engaging with the internet and certain tools and devices. And then back in 2015, I'd always had a personal interest in health and wellness, but back in 2015, there was this big scandal involving an Australian influencer called Belle Gibson. And she had a pretty large following at the time. So it was around 200,000 followers on Instagram, which back then was a lot. And she'd built this whole online brand about curing herself from a really rare terminal form of brain cancer through generic lifestyle practices. And it was the things we're quite accustomed to hearing about, such as going plant-based, consuming whole foods, reducing or restricting things like coffee, alcohol. But then she'd also include things like rejecting chemotherapy and radiotherapy. In some of her earlier forums, there was some anti-vaccine posts. And I mean, she had a really reputable brand, so much so that she was legitimized by Apple. So she had this app that she was developing with Apple. She had a book with Penguin. So she'd built an online brand on social media, but she was actually gaining a huge amount of legitimacy through these very reputable brands and actually through the media as well. Multiple magazines were celebrating her as this fearless female and, again, just giving credibility to her story and her brand. And then anyway, back in 2015, this was all exposed as a fraud. And a lot of the subsequent media discussions focused on her as an individual, and they'd ask questions such as what was motivating her? Was she driven by criminal intent? Or was it a psychological disorder that she was suffering from? That tended to be the take that a lot of the media were engaging in. And my co-author, Chris Rojek, and I actually thought it missed the more interesting question, which is how were figures like Belle Gibson even able to emerge and build these brands that rivaled medical expertise? Like, what was going on, not just socially and culturally, but also with the technologies that was enabling figures like this to emerge. So we started with this question, and back in 2015, we wrote an article, which actually wasn't published till about 4 years later. It went through various iterations. But suffice to say, we wrote that. Then we wrote a book that we started in 2017, but the article had laid the groundwork for that. And then the book also came out in 2019. I mean, publication can be quite long. But so we'd had this real interest in particular, influencers and how expertise was established online. And then the pandemic occurred. And so I wrote to Chris, I still have the email. I wrote to him, I think it was March 2020. And I said, I have this idea. I feel like what we're seeing shares a lot of similarities with Belle Gibson. But what I'm seeing that is different is the way in which a lot of these techniques that she used are being used for collective ends. And so it was things that we would now call QAnon, or a lot more politicized messages that were being used by influencers as calls to action to basically create an alternative political system or systems of influence and messages. And so it was in some way bore similarity to what we looked at with Belle Gibson, but there were also clear differences. So I went on to write an article that I think captured really what was happening, an article on out health influencers. And then that was sort of just one of the angles. I guess the pandemic was quite a busy time because I'd already been studying the space really closely for 5 years prior to the pandemic. So during the pandemic, there was just an opportunity to apply a lot of those ideas and explore, I guess, what would be referred to as health and wellness, myths or disinformation in a variety of contexts.
Yeah, and you know what? I found out about that a little bit late. So hopefully I get to have you on to talk about that a little bit more, after I do some research too, because that was, even in America, I was in America when that happened, and it was crazy to see what was like unfolding with like basic things around not even just the vaccination, just wearing masks. Seeing some Facebook friends say they're not going to wear masks. It was weird, and they're healthcare professionals. It was such a weird time. So how do you think influencers establish, based off of your research, how do you think they establish trust, intimacy, and authority? Sorry.
Yeah. So in the work that Chris and I conducted together, so this is prior to the pandemic, we basically noticed that there were 3 ways that influencers established intimacy and trust with their audience. And some of this builds on previous work on micro-celebrity. So just to highlight, micro-celebrity is this term that is used primarily as a noun. Theresa Senft coined the term. It's to describe celebrities who build an audience and achieve a degree of fame online. And she talked a lot about authenticity as being one of the ways that these micro-celebrities would achieve fame, through appearing more real. And we definitely noticed that in our work as well. But what we also noticed was that in addition to appearing authentic, they would also present themselves as accessible. So even if they, in one sense, appeared, maybe in the health and wellness space, they appear exceptionally beautiful or physically attractive, right? Because they're often using their own image to sell a product. They would still try to create the impression of being accessible by virtue of using the same social media platforms, occasionally responding to someone in a comment. And it breaks down the distance that you would usually see between, say, a traditional celebrity and a follower. So that was another way that we noticed these influencers were establishing intimacy. And then the third one was autonomy. And autonomy is really crucial in the health space. It's this idea that you are independent from the system. So you can see that as independent from the mainstream media or independent from the medical establishment. And so what they would often indicate is that they could be trusted. They were more trustworthy than, say, a medical practitioner, because they weren't compromised by the powers that be, by financial incentives or political incentives, the same way that the quote unquote medical establishment are. And so it's those three aspects: authenticity, accessibility, and crucially for the health space, autonomy, that would cultivate this sense of trust and intimacy with their followers.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. So you pretty much just broke down what an alternative health influencer is. So I don't ask you what they are. They're basically just, they're kind of pivoting themselves. Not, I want to say it necessarily against the traditional models of healthcare, but
Yeah, they do tend to, because often what they are trying to do is to distance themselves from the medical establishment by promoting alternative views or remedies.
Really?
It's interesting. There's a way in which they build on, I think, a lot of the pioneers of the wellness movement, because we often think about wellness as this contemporary pursuit, or even, a commodity, really. But actually, the history of wellness is very much linked to the counterculture in the US, even though it draws on a lot of ancient ideas. It's kind of a selective interpretation of the past. And if you look at the pioneers of the wellness movement, they were actually not seeing themselves as healers. They didn't see wellness as a way to heal someone of illness and disease. They actually criticized the medical model because they thought the medical model was primarily about treating illness and taking someone to a neutral state. And what the founders of the wellness movement were really interested in was a positive conception of health, where you could look at, living your best life, essentially, or this would manifest both physically, mentally, and I mean, you'd also add spiritually, because they had a holistic conception of health. But it's a very different model from what they saw medicine as
Right.
fulfilling. They saw it as really about improving one's well-being rather than treating illness and disease. And I think you can sort of see out health in a similar way. Some of them have now merged with, I think, a lot of these healers, and it confuses things and confounds things, because they will often talk about remedies and things like that. But it's quite different from the wellness pioneers, who were much more focused on positive health.
Right. And so this is just such a, what you're talking about is just, it's so interesting for multiple reasons. One, because the medical system isn't perfect. And we'll talk about conspiracy theories a little bit later, but there's clearly people trying to, capitalize on the fact that the medical system isn't perfect. But the medical system does use the system in what creates a good procedure to be done, etc. It's based off of models of research and data, and years and years and years and years of research and data for most of the procedures that we do, and all of these things. When it comes to the alternative space, there's really no, I don't know if I'm wrong about this, but I don't think there's really any data around a lot of the ideas that they talk about, right? It's really just all personal. It's all
a lot of it tends to be an N of one, and they will often elevate personal experience. I think we've got to be careful with how they do that and how we understand it, because it's very easy to deride people who use personal anecdotes to validate some kind of protocol. I understand that, because it's very difficult to falsify, and we see it misused so much in the space. So I'm very sympathetic on the one hand to why people are critical of using personal anecdotes as evidence and comparing them to, say, control trials. At the same time, if we're being charitable there are some people who feel as though they do actually try to get medical treatment. They have certain issues that people just cannot solve.
That is
And so they start trying to experiment with and test certain diets or lifestyle practices, and they see what works. And so I think part of what makes this space so difficult to navigate is that you have explicit misuse of things like personal anecdotes to sell really fraudulent products, some of which are harmful. But then you also have some people who have the best intentions and are just trying to share their story. And it's quite difficult for someone who is in the space to discern what is what, because they often look really similar. But I'm sure most of us know people who, suffer from some sort of illness and have found that they have had to try a series of different procedures and protocols to find something that enables them just to tolerate pain or, what would be seen as ill health, basically.
Yeah, very well put, Stephanie, because there's like, for example, if you have autoimmune issues, you're not going to get a lot of help in the medical space. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of doctors that don't understand autoimmune issues, for example. But, and there are people in the alternative health space who have dealt with trying to figure out, okay, let me try a different diet. Let me try, something new to to find out, does this work? Is this going to help with my symptoms and etc. So you definitely have people that are just talking about their own stories and what has worked for them. When do you think it gets dangerous? When does it start to become, which is a very hard question, because it's like you said, it's hard to parse out. But have you noticed any patterns of when it's when it's actually dangerous?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is if we look at an influencer tends to be someone who's cultivated a brand, and they're using that either for social, economic, or political gain. So social gain is clout or fame. Economic gain is financial incentives, and political gain is just to spread some type of political message. And it may be that an influencer has one intention. They may have several of those, or possibly even all three. But I think the most obvious example of harms is the financial aspect. It's when you see people who are really exploiting vulnerability. And I use the word exploiting quite deliberately, because you do see in this space, I mean, it just couldn't be described any other way than a kind of snake oil sales, where, for example, there'll be some disease that a lot of people are suffering from, and they will promote these miracle cures, often in very evocative ways. And so it's like a form of advertising. But obviously it's really harmful because you're playing on people's vulnerabilities. And if you are discouraging people from using medical procedures or treatments that actually really could help them, and you're discouraging them from going down that path, promoting something that has no evidence whatsoever, that's explicitly harmful. And so I saw that in my most recent research on cancer cures, where I was exploring this on TikTok. And it concerned me deeply because the way I entered this field back in 2015 was through Belle Gibson promoting this fake narrative about curing a rare form of cancer. And of course, we cannot quantify the harms that resulted from her story, because we have no way of knowing how many people she influenced, yet we also have no way of knowing what the consequences of that influence were, right? Like, did they reject chemotherapy like she said she did? Or we just cannot know. And what I saw in my most recent research that I conducted in April and May, where I mimicked someone who had been diagnosed with cancer, and I conducted a study where I looked at the top 50 posts each week over a 1 month period. And what I found was that 81% of the posts that I looked at when I typed in cancer cure, so again, this is over a 4-week period, contained either false or misleading advice about cancer cures. And so much of it was monetized. And so to answer your question, I think this is the really harmful aspect, because you're not only playing on someone's desperation, right? Like people are, it's this really one of the most awful things that can happen to you is that you or a loved one has some kind of terminal diagnosis or a very severe diagnosis, and then to suggest that there is actually a remedy and that you have that and that someone can purchase it and that they shouldn't actually use the medical treatment offered to them. I think that's really dangerous. And so that's the first thing that comes to mind. I think, there are other harmful messages in terms of the way in which politics is often used by a lot of these influencers. And I saw this a lot more during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So a lot of the influencers that I followed advocated for certain political leaders. They sowed a lot of division in institutions. And I mean, there's a lot of discussion now about low trust, but this is actually something that we observed even back in 2015. So much so that when we wrote our book, Lifestyle Gurus, for which Belle Gibson was the inspiration, our last chapter was called Low Trust Society. And what we meant by that was that we were living in a society that was characterized by low institutional trust. And that this lack of trust in institutions meant that there were these alternative guru figures who could then acquire people's trust and earn it, because it's not that trust just dissipates, right? Like we always have to trust something.
That's right.
And so I think that, of course, the fake remedies, some of which would literally cause physical harm or, I mean, even death in some cases, obviously that's overtly harmful. But I think harm also operates in terms of sowing doubt, creating division, uncertainty, and we see this a lot in the space too.
Yeah, I do want to say, like earlier when I was saying that, the medical field, there's a lot of questions that the medical field hasn't answered. I do want to just make clear that I'm not saying that just means like forget the medical field,
Yeah, of course.
I'm just, I am just pointing out, like you even mentioned that there are diseases and problems that people have that I think make them vulnerable to the alternative health space. But I do think that a lot of people place all of these like I don't know what the word is, like the criteria that they place on the medical profession is not the criteria that they place on alternative health, alternative health space at all. And like you said, you have to trust something. And so it's interesting, and hopefully we can get into this a little bit. It's interesting how they do end up trusting a lot of these alternative health influencers, but that the safeguard that they have when they're thinking about the medical space is just not the same. It's just the expectations are like what they expect from them is not there when you compare it to like medical professionals. They use different criteria, different thought patterns. It almost seems like when it comes to, thinking about the medical profession or thinking about the health setting, and then thinking about someone on YouTube talking about, or TikTok or whatever, talking about something that might cure them. So that I think that's just an interesting dynamic in itself. But
I think part of that, just to build on your point, is one of the things we noticed when we were researching this back in 2015 is it's not just the techniques that a lot of these influencers are using to establish trust and intimacy. It's the fact that if you think, for example, about a medical professional or even a therapist in the context of mental health, there is actually a degree of professional distance that is required.
Right.
And so you're not promoting yourself as someone's friend, right? It's
Oh,
there is meant to be a sense of healthy separation and a boundary of sorts, and that does not apply to the online realm and the space that influencers establish their authority in. And so I think that really confuses things for people. And also, I think sometimes people are seeking different things. I mean, what's really interesting is that when I asked my own students at university, this was a couple of years ago, but I remember asking them about their choices. So when would you see a doctor? And I remember asking them, how many of you would go and see a doctor if you just wanted to feel better? So there's nothing explicitly wrong with you, but you just want to feel better. And not one of them put up their hand. And this was an 80+ class
wow.
of students. And they all indicated that they would see a doctor if something were wrong with them or they felt explicitly ill, but they would never see a doctor and just call up the medical center if they just want to improve their sense of well-being. And so I sometimes think that part of the issue here is that there are different markets. Like even a lot of the more nefarious wellness influencers that I follow, I'm sure they would go and see a medical practitioner if they broke their leg, but they're not going to see them about dietary advice or wellness modalities, right? And so in one sense, they're almost treated quite differently, like the way health and medicine is understood and wellness is understood. And increasingly we see that wellness has this spiritual dimension, which was actually foundational to the wellness movement. It's just that depending on who was promoting it, sometimes spirituality was seen more as purpose and meaning in a more secular sense. And for other people, it was very much associated with a type of almost new age spirituality. So it tends to have a slightly different meaning depending on who is actually promoting it. But I think it makes a lot of sense how people get misled. And as I said, I mean, even as someone who studies some of the worst aspects of the space, I still think there's a lot of people who promote helpful things and provide useful advice. But again, if anything, this is what makes the space so difficult to navigate, because you can't, some of it's overtly harmful, but others, it's just a lot more nuanced. And so you have to know how to read certain things. And I think even the best of us get, at times duped and yeah, everyone sort of has their blind spots, right?
I've definitely had a few blind spots in diet. So I was on a keto diet for a very long time, and I thought it was gonna like cure everything. So I'm definitely not. And that was off of videos from.
Yeah, and the problem is people often, especially if you think of dietary advice, people often do feel better when they start eliminating certain things, and so they're not wrong in the feedback that they're getting and the sort of immediate results. But as you alluded to earlier, the problem is we don't always have long-term clinical data about what the implications will be over time. And so that can be problematic because short-term you might feel really good because you're eliminating certain things, but you don't actually know always what's happening internally, especially if you're not, engaging in blood work and things like that. So, yeah.
I do also think that a huge problem with the medical space is we're not trained to focus on preventative care at all. So there's a huge space for people to be, to capitalize on that, because we just fix you. If you break a bone, if you
Totally. I think the difference, what I really see increasingly, I haven't written a lot about this, but it's something I've observed, is that there is this melding that I'm seeing quite recently with medicine and wellness, and prevention is part of what they offer, like preventative care. but it's so inaccessible to most people. It's offered to those with extreme wealth. And so you'll often see people, not just taking supplements, but engaging in all these practices and IV drips and all these things.
Right.
But they have to be able to afford it. And often these medical practitioners charge really high fees for this type of care. And so unfortunately, it's just not something that is mainstream. It is really only available to a minority of people.
That's a good point. So, like you were talking about a little bit earlier, you said that 81%, you did a study where you found that 81% of videos on TikTok were essentially fake news. We can pretty much say they were, spouting information that wasn't medically sound, basically, and only.
So this was a study, I should be really clear, it was a study on cancer cures. So I wouldn't want to say it's representative of all health information on the platform. But it was looking at the top 50 videos that were recommended by the app TikTok when I searched for cancer cure, and analyzing those and essentially the quality of the content, but also the tactics and techniques that we use to spread certain fake cancer cures of those that did. That was 81% of them. And then crucially, what I found, as I said, was how tools were being, like Linktree, were being used to monetize these fake cures. And I think part of the problem is that it's just so accessible and so easy to monetize content. There's so little regulation. And I see this as a real issue. And I only focused on TikTok. I mean, I haven't studied the same example on YouTube Shorts or Instagram Reels. But what was alarming for me was that it was just at a scale that I've never seen on any other platform. And I think so much of that is because of the centrality of the algorithm to the user experience on TikTok, and the way in which as soon as you open the app, your For You page is just feeding you this endless scroll of videos. And if you're looking for health content, often what's really engaging are these sensational videos, which are all about promising miracle cures and hooking people because it offers something that they're alleging mainstream medical practitioners aren't providing people for whatever reason.
Yeah, an offer. So these were the top 50 recommended videos that you were looking at.
Yeah, so each week. So I was trying to simulate the experience of someone who had been diagnosed with cancer. Because in that situation, you think about somebody and, many people would be afraid to go down the path of conventional medicine, quite rightly, quite understandably. And what sort of content were people being recommended on the platform? So that was the approach I took. As I said, over a 1-month period, often people have to act quite quickly. And I just found these really common techniques of the way in which these fake cancer cures were being recommended. So the interesting thing is that, unsurprisingly, a large proportion of the fake cancer cure videos were presented through these personal anecdotes. It would be somebody either describing how they overcame cancer or how a loved one overcame cancer. But the other thing that dominated was almost the same amount. What I referred to as contrarian doctors. And these were people who had the qualifications and legitimacy of a mainstream medical practitioner, but would present a contrarian stance, right? Like, this is what the medical establishment don't want you to know. Or sometimes it would be combined with a conspiratorial narrative. There is a cure. They don't want you to know it, and these people have been imprisoned for it. But actually, the conspiratorial aspect was not the most prevalent. It was just this contrarian doctor who would promote themselves as a renegade of sorts, presenting a view that was in opposition to the mainstream medical view. And then I also noticed another Another theme that was not as prevalent, but it was still common, was spirituality. So this idea about having faith, and it was sometimes tied to conventional religions, but sometimes it was just faith in nature and faith in food and the body. And so it was faith in a broader sense, or spirituality in a broader sense. And sometimes it was just informative. There were quite a lot of posts that fell into the category of what I refer to as informative posts that would just have a voiceover where they would say, did you know that such and such cures cancer? And this is how it works. And it would be very almost like an infomercial. And in most cases, monetizing that through a link in bio tool. So this particular article is called Link in Bio precisely because it was just the most common route to monetization, where people would promote a fake cancer cure and then use the link in bio tool to monetize the product.
Yeah, I was reading that TikTok platforms these influencers, or excuse me, allows these influencers to have an e-commerce link so that people can purchase sometimes harmful products from these same accounts that are talking about cancer cures, and it's not it's not medically based. It's just...
No, that's right. And I think part of what makes TikTok more vulnerable to this, and you could also add Instagram Reels or YouTube Shorts. I haven't studied those particular platforms with regard to this topic, but part of what makes them so vulnerable is that if you look at the way that the algorithm works, it recommends both people that you follow, but also people that you don't follow. So it's this combination of known and unknown creators. And even for those that you don't follow, some of the people who are the content creators promoting the videos that you will be recommended have really high follower counts. But many of the videos in this study that were recommended to me had like 3 or 4 views. And so there's no way really of assessing the quality of the content that you're being recommended. Because if you think, for example, of the traditional social media model, often these influencers like Belle Gibson had to work relatively hard to build quite a large online following. Even though there's low barriers to entry to try to build a brand online, it actually still requires a huge amount of effort and luck, right? Like you might try and put a lot of effort in and you just cannot gain a large following. What TikTok does is promote both very well-known creators, but also unknown creators with just a small amount of followers. So it's really easy for people to gain visibility without actually having to put a huge amount of content up and a huge amount of work into building a brand. And so even if their account is taken down, they can just, create another one and becomes this game of whack-a-mole. So I think this is so central to the problem, is the fact that it's just so easy to cut through the noise as somebody who's unknown. And if you think about people who are using these platforms for more nefarious reasons, it gives them a visibility that they just traditionally would not have had,
Wow. Yeah. Let me ask you, so for people that are trying to be ethical with these web, like TikTok and stuff like that, they're trying to be more ethical influencers. What would you recommend anything?
Yeah. So, I mean, I laugh because there's quite a few things that come to mind. The first one would be really explicit as an influencer about what you know and what you don't know, and what your areas of expertise are and what they're not. And I think that's just really important, not only in the health and wellness space, just in general online, to be very clear about what you know and what you don't know, what your domain expertise is and what it isn't. Because you have that obligation, I think, to the consumer or the users that are following you. So I'd say that is a huge one. I think another one is just obviously, if you're thinking about influencers promoting products or endorsing products, I think, again, just being very upfront about who they are produced by, what they can and cannot do. I mean, even during COVID, we saw some pretty well-known brands that were alluding to the benefits of their product for curing flu viruses. And it was like really verging on being extremely misleading. And in Australia, I think they did a very good job. When I say they, the Therapeutic Goods Association, because I can think of both an influencer straight away and a very well-known athleisure brand that were fined for this misleading type of health product. I don't see that happening to the same extent with a lot of other regulatory bodies. And so I think there is an ethical obligation as somebody in the space to be very honest about what a product can and cannot do. And that would be another one. I think there's also, I mean, even with one's story, I think there is again an ethical obligation if you're sharing something publicly to be honest and not to exaggerate it. And in a lot of the spaces that I follow, there are these groups, especially in the wellness space, that are teaching people how to create these very sensational stories to hook people. And this is what you do, and it needs to include this and this. And again, I just think that there is an ethical imperative there that you are evoking an emotional response from people. That's precisely why this is being taught as a strategy. And it's really important to be upfront and honest. So I'd say those are a few things. I mean, I would also extend this to medical practitioners as well. I think a lot of what we saw during the pandemic was that people were not always upfront about what was known and what was unknown. And that is where a huge amount of distrust emanated from. So I think it's an obligation of both influencers, but I'd say anyone in the domain of health,
to just be mostly just transparent. Don't exaggerate. Don't lie. Is basically.
And be very honest about what you don't know. I mean, there's real confidence with saying to someone, I do not know, right? Like, I can answer something, I do not know this, and being upfront. And think about how reassuring that is when someone can be comfortable enough to be honest about the limitations of their expertise and to sit in the murkiness of it. And I think the best medical practitioners or influencers in the space will do that. They will be upfront when there's something that they're uncertain about. And contrary to what people may think, that actually garners a huge amount of trust, because if they're honest enough to say, I don't know something, when they say they do know it, you can be more confident that they do have knowledge in that area.
That is, that's so so well put, Stephanie. Very simple and so well put. I will say sometimes when you come off as more cautious, and like even me, like I'm naturally a little bit self-doubtful and cautious and stuff like that, which I don't mind. I think it's very healthy. But it just seems like people that are able to speak with such confidence and clarity and all those things, they induce that in somebody else. They induce that confidence. They like it's like contagious or something. I don't know. Like emotions are. They trigger that confidence in that someone. They trigger that ability to just feel very good and trust what the person is saying, basically. And obviously that's good if the person actually knows what they're talking about. But even like the temperaments of a lot of researchers, they tend to be naturally, I think, much more cautious. And I don't know. And part of that is just understanding, being an expert in something means there's a lot of stuff that the field doesn't know, period. But I'm just bringing that point up to say that for a lot of people, it is very tempting to, when they think of being an authority figure, of speaking with a lot of confidence and conviction and authority and all that stuff. But like you're saying, that's fine if what you're saying is true and you know what you're saying and you do know what you're talking about. It's when you don't. It can be.
Yeah. I mean, if you think of politics, I understand what you're saying. And I think there is definitely a sense that there is a certain charisma that can come with being very assertive. I think very quickly that unravels in the domain of health, especially when you look at the, say, response to the pandemic. When people speak confidently about something that is uncertain, and then the uncertainty is exposed. And that just naturally for people generates a sense of distrust. And we saw this very explicitly in the UK, where I think politicians at the time thought it was very clever to hide behind the legitimacy of science. So a lot of the policy issues that were being implemented were backed by this, well, the Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, would say, were being led by the science, as though it was fixed, definitive, clear. But these were often policy issues about which, we described it as a wicked problem. There was not one clear solution. But this veneer of legitimacy that was provided by science was this way of legitimizing their policies, but it very quickly unraveled because it wasn't science leading it. These were policy issues. They were complicated. There were always trade-offs. And it wasn't a tame solution like they were trying to present. So, yeah, I definitely can see what you mean about the assertive aspect, but I think in the context of science and medicine, no matter what issue we're talking about, that there's a sense of a credibility for someone lacks when they're exposed as speaking about issues confidently when it's just not the case, that the certainty isn't there.
Yeah, the certainty is gone. You speak so well. I'm very tempted to ask you, why do you, even though the medical field made so many mistakes during COVID with exactly what you just said, pretending that the science was there and confidently saying things when it wasn't, why was the alternative space not the answer either?
Why was it not the answer?
It wasn't.
Well, no, I mean, I almost think that the dichotomy between the mainstream and the alternative, even though that's conveniently used with a lot of influencers, it's actually a facade. I mean, I'm sure you know this firsthand, working in the medical field, but there's a huge amount of divergence between what doctors think. They're not this unified establishment. It's a kind of very convenient straw man that is often used. And there absolutely are organizations that have to have some degree of consensus to operate and to propose certain policies or guidelines. But the medical field is extremely dynamic and many people hold different views. And I think that part of the way out of this confusion is to recognize that actually in a lot of cases, while there are some things that are more clear cut, there are a lot of aspects of health and wellness, and especially when you start looking at diet and nutrition, that are a lot more complicated. And many medical practitioners, as true scientists, are trying to navigate this space and understand it, and the knowledge is imperfect. And so partly I think the answer is to unravel that and to realize actually that it's not this established view versus an alternative space, that there's actually a lot of slippage in between. And so invariably it won't be that the alternative will have the answer, because it's not just an alternative. There's at times very strong consensus around something, and at other times, especially with some issues, there's just a lack, and people, I guess, have to sit with the discomfort. That.
Gotcha. It's more being able to sit with the discomfort of the unknowing, the not knowing. Yeah. So what if you had to create the traits of you kind of, I'm not going to answer that because I see that. What role do you think desperation plays in all of this?
Yeah, I think it's a huge vulnerability. So going back to the study that we just discussed, the cancer cure study, I think anyone who has experienced cancer personally or knows a loved one who has, it's a moment of desperation, right? You're facing your mortality. People just want to find a solution. And I think that applies to many illnesses where people are desperate for a cure. And that's where they're very, very vulnerable to people who are promoting these miracle cures, because often people feel an inclination to act quickly. They don't actually often have a fantastic prognosis that is being offered to them by medical practitioners. So when someone comes along and says, actually, there is a solution and I can sell it to you and this will be effective, you can see why that's attractive. And of course, we can think of extreme examples and you might think, why would someone fall for that? But it's not always so ridiculous. And a colleague and I who were actually working in this space during the pandemic, we were struck at the time by how many people we found on these short video platforms who were not only promoting things like ivermectin as a substitute for vaccines, but in the videos that they would share, they would actually go through the protocol themselves and talk about how they went down to the vet and bought ivermectin for, say, horses, and they would show you using it. Oh, you just use this much, and this is how much I take, and this is how I do it. And so you can see when people are feeling worried, as in during the pandemic, or when people are feeling a sense of desperation, which I think is totally understandable when they're faced with some type of illness, whether it be themselves or a loved one. I think it makes a huge amount of sense why they would be more vulnerable to certain miracle cures.
And you spoke about some of the contrarian doctors that are on the, like, that you saw on this the TikTok platform. Why do you think that I don't, you wouldn't technically know, but why do you think they're on the platform? From what you gathered, talking about contrarian ideas, do you think it's genuine, or do you think it's like money, finance? There's some type of profit that comes from it. Why do you think there's such a good percentage? I think it was what you said. How much percent? I think I read something like 37% of misleading videos featured contrarian doctors. Does it come off as genuine contrarian views? Like they genuinely are like, look, what they're saying is wrong, and etc. And I can tell you why. Or was there some type of profit motivation in making these types of videos?
Yeah. So the honest truth is motivation is really difficult to understand. And I think it's always wise to have a degree of caution when trying to infer someone's motivation. However, what you can do as a researcher, and what I've been doing for the good part of a decade, is you can trace how the information someone is promoting is being used. And what struck me, as I said, with this most recent study about cancer cures on TikTok, was the extent to which these videos were being monetized. And so whether they believe it or not, it's not for me to judge. But what we can say is that they are financially profiting from this stance, right? And I just think the ease with which these videos and the content that they feature can be monetized, whether the platform wants this or not, it does incentivize people to produce, false and misleading content because there is a profit motive there. Right? And I mean, this would be relatively easy to regulate. This is what I find quite disappointing as someone who works in the space. There are some things that genuinely are difficult to tackle, but there are others which I think are really easy to prevent. And this is one of them. And so what I don't understand is why things like this are so prevalent. And I don't just put the responsibility on tech platforms. I think that, as I gave you the example, you look at the Therapeutic Goods Association in Australia, and I think it does a wonderful job cracking down on a lot of this explicitly fraudulent advice. And some countries, I think, are more effective at this than others. But if you don't have strong regulation from the state level and the tech level, then it's just a free-for-all for people to create this sort of content and to monetize it. It's lucrative.
How do you think conspiracy theories play into this?
Yeah. So conspiracy theories was one of the themes, one of the 6 themes that I looked at in this recent study on cancer cures. It actually didn't feature as commonly as I expected. As someone, I guess I've just been studying the space a lot since the pandemic. So I had expected that it would be more dominant than it was. But there's no doubt that we do see a lot of conspiratorial content in the health space, primarily because what it does is reflect this idea that institutions can't be trusted, that the establishment can't be trusted, and encourage people to seek alternatives. So you can see a kind of essentialist definition of a conspiracy, right? That there's this powerful group of elites who either control or seek to control society. You can see how that view of the world fits very conveniently with someone who is trying to promote the idea that, the medical establishment can't be trusted and that instead you should use their alternative remedy and seek alternative advice. They fit very well together. But yeah, as I said, with my most recent work, I didn't see it as much as I had thought it would play out. But certainly during the pandemic, it was really central. And yeah, absolutely. And I think for a lot of reasons, but one was because health information and dis or misinformation became much more politicized. So, I mean, it's always been politicized to some extent. You look at, for example, traditional anti-vaxxers were often very left-leaning and very suspicious of corporations, understandably to some extent, right? And increasingly what we saw during the pandemic was that the anti-vaccination movement aligned much more with a conservative politics. And we saw, whether you call QAnon a conspiracy theory or a new religious movement or a cult, I mean, it's just depending on who's describing it, it is explained and conceived in different ways. But I think the conspiratorial certainly played a really large role in how health mis and disinformation circulated during the pandemic. And I think that made a lot of sense at a time when people felt very restricted and very controlled by the state.
Yeah.
Obviously, some people more than others. But yeah, that's certainly at the heart, I think, of why it became more prevalent in the debate.
How do you just spoke recently, you just said that you think that some of these problems that are on TikTok can be an easy fix, or it can allow people to be incentivized a little bit differently, I guess be more cautious. How can we restructure or create incentives to get people to be more careful about about monetizing off of false information?
Sorry, do you mean from the creator's perspective or do you mean from the user's perspective to be more cautious?
Let's do both.
Okay. So I think from the creator's perspective, there needs to be certain consequences of promoting really harmful advice. And so if you look, for example, you started this conversation by talking about being a nurse and the idea of almost like the Hippocratic Oath and do no harm. And I think that anyone who is publishing content and certainly monetizing it, there needs to be some kind of regulation that they have, and some kind of consequence for promoting very harmful content. So I'd say that's one. I mean, if there are just no guardrails, then it's an absolute free-for-all. And it puts all of the pressure onto the individual consumer. So that would be one, just like a medical practitioner has a license board or kind of regulatory body. I think the same needs to be true of someone who is online. And I'm not talking about extreme content moderation where you can't question something. I mean, I don't think that's desirable, but certainly if you're doing things like promoting some oil or, I mean, the stuff I saw was so extreme. It was things like breakfast remedies that would be used. It was used as a cancer remedy, but then they'd also claim down the line in the video, because often these videos were quite long. We think of TikTok as a short video app, but some of them were lengthy, and they'd then talk about how in one particular video that I'm thinking about, how this breakfast remedy not only cures cancer, but it also cured his grandson of autism, right? And just like extreme things, but you can understand how someone could be in a situation where that's really appealing to them. So on the one hand, I think there's an onus on regulatory bodies to regulate content creators or influencers, because they're not just influencers, right? This is another thing on TikTok. A lot of them are content creators who don't actually have huge influence. So one would be having some kind of regulation that oversees that. I think in terms of consumers, being much more discerning about who we follow, understanding how influence operates, right?
Yeah.
Like influence is different to persuasion. What I also noticed a lot in this article on cancer cures is that it wasn't influence that was being exerted, it was persuasion. They were using persuasive tools to encourage people to take certain actions. So it wasn't that a lot of my earlier work, like going back to Belle Gibson, was how Belle Gibson established herself as an influencer with a huge amount of followers. But a lot of these content creators who were promoting fake cancer cures had very small followings. But as I said, because of the way the app combines the known and the unknown, they were able to cut through the noise. And so they weren't relying on their influence as a content creator. They would rely on persuasive tactics and techniques to create a very compelling video. And that's quite different. And yeah, so I think one aspect is regulation for the influencer, but the other would be, I guess, more education for the consumer about what to look for and how to discern who to follow and who not to follow. I mean, in one sense, it's interesting. If you study history, you do to this to some extent. You look at something called historiography, where you learn about the purpose and the perspective of the historian. I think teaching a degree of critical thinking at schools is healthy. But again, I wouldn't want to put all the onus on the individual consumer. I do think there needs to be guardrails. Otherwise, it's just a free-for-all of very savvy advertising techniques that are being used to encourage people in certain directions and in some cases manipulating them.
Right. And I think a question I wasn't going to ask you, but I think I'm going to just ask you is, what do you think are the traits that kind of make up someone who is extremely susceptible to influence from some of these individuals that are selling like fake TikTok cures? I know it's multi-layered, because like I come from a family where my family are immigrants, and I just remember like my dad had a very deep, like he didn't trust the medical field, the healthcare institutions. Some of that is part of from the has to do with the country that he came from. But it was interesting, like when he got diagnosed with diabetes and all these things, he really didn't want to take insulin, and some of that is just like probably like there's this idea around taking medicine, like probably negative connotations around what does that mean if I have to take medicine to help myself. Some people do have like they don't like the idea of being the person that takes medicine. if that makes sense. There's a lot of people who think like that, but it was just interesting. He would go to like alternative medicine doctors, and part of why he didn't like the medical field was, oh, they're profiting, and there's some truth to that. It's complicated with the healthcare system, with pharmaceutical companies and all that stuff. It is a complicated dynamic, but he would just go to this alternative medicine doctor, and they would give him like a drink, like a really disgusting drink. And it was like natural, whatever, like they made it from the ground. They would advertise it as it was like some natural alternative to help him with his disease. But I mean, they're profiting as well, is what, as an adult is kind of what I think. It's like, well, they're profiting off of that as well. And it's not necessarily that profit is bad. But it's, like I said, and you did address this earlier. It's just interesting. Like you said, people are going to the alternative space for different reasons than the medical space. It's a sense of well-being. It's a sense of probably wanting to find a cure the way that they want to find a cure, not the way that the medical system may want to give them a cure. But I do feel like even before the pandemic happened, there is a certain type of person that might be a lot more susceptible to this idea of just the alternative health space, and specifically people that are not really, I don't know. Those are long-winded.
I think one way you could also think about it is, yes, people are going to these spaces for different reasons, but also it's not just a suspicion of money. Often these people are suspicious of state power, right? Like centralized state authority. And sometimes, as you alluded to, with your father, it's for good reason, right? And in the US, there is a history of discrimination against marginalized groups based on gender and race, sometimes religion. And so it makes sense that certain groups are more suspicious than others. The problem is we also have a series of people who exploit that distrust, right? They seed it, they sow it. So both can be true, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I guess I'm trying to figure out some practical, you did mention some practical things that people can do, but I don't know. It's difficult. Well, thank you so much, Stephanie, for coming on. You're very well spoken and very cautious of what you say, and you try to have a very balanced view. You don't, you try to give, you play that devil's advocate in your own head. Like you'll say this is, where the medical field has a plus side and where they have some downsides, and this is where the alternative health space has some plus sides and some downsides. So I do love how cautious you are when you speak. You're definitely the epitome of a good researcher.
Oh, thank you. It's been really lovely talking with you.
Yes.
And yeah.
Did you want people to reach you if they wanted to, or are you some researchers like, no, just
I keep meaning to create a website one day. You can just find me online. If you are interested in my work, you can go to Google Scholar. I have a university profile page. My collaborators and I just created a mini podcast called 21st Century Cults that you can find about these cult gurus. So yeah, that's mostly where you can find me.
awesome. Thank you so much, Stephanie.
Thank you for